Sometimes the most broken things make the most beautiful sounds when they're being mended. Sarah Mitchell learned this truth on a dusty afternoon in Colorado Territory when shame tried to steal her future and kindness refused to let it win. She stood in the middle of Cattle Creek Ranch, wrapped in nothing but a torn bedsheet and 3 years of carefully buried terror, watching a stranger approach with water and soap like they were sacraments. The cloth clung to her trembling frame, doing little to hide the evidence of what she'd endured. The scars that mapped a journey through hell, the hollow look in her eyes that spoke of things no woman should survive. "Ma'am," said the cowboy, his voice gentle as Sunday morning rain, "let's get you cleaned up." That's when the words escaped her lips like a confession she'd never meant to make. "I'm not clean." The whisper carried 3 years of captivity, of being told she was ruined, worthless, stained beyond redemption. "I'll never be clean." Most men would have stepped back. Most men would have seen the damage and decided it was too much, too complicated, too broken to fix. Most men would have offered polite sympathy and pointed her toward the nearest church or charitable organization, washing their hands of responsibility. But Jake Morrison wasn't most men. What Sarah didn't know was that Jake had seen his share of broken things: horses beaten until they couldn't trust human hands, land scorched by drought until it seemed impossible to grow anything beautiful again, his own soul scarred by war until he'd thought he'd never feel whole. He'd learned that healing wasn't about erasing what had happened, but about choosing what happened next. When Sarah spoke those words, "I'm not clean," Jake saw something she couldn't see in herself. He saw a survivor. He saw strength wrapped in shame, courage disguised as brokenness. A woman who had endured the unendurable and was still standing. "Miss," he said, his voice steady as bedrock, "clean isn't something you are or aren't. Clean is something you become, one day at a time, one moment at a time. And it's not about what happened to you, it's about what you choose to do now." He set the basin of warm water on a wooden crate and stepped back, giving her space, giving her choice. "This water's warm, and the soap smells like lavender. My sister sent it from Denver. There's a curtain hanging right there for privacy, and I'll be over by the barn if you need anything. Take all the time you need." Then he walked away, this cowboy who could have taken what he wanted, who could have seen her vulnerability as opportunity. Instead, he gave her the one thing she'd forgotten existed: respect for her own agency, her own healing, her own worth. As Jake's footsteps faded toward the barn, Sarah stared at the simple basin of water like it held the power to wash away more than dirt. For the first time in 3 years, someone had looked at her brokenness and seen not something to fix or use, but someone to honor. Someone worthy of patience, of kindness, of the radical act of letting her choose her own healing. What Sarah didn't know was that this moment, this choice between shame and hope, between hiding and healing, would become the first page of a love story that proved the most powerful force in the American West wasn't gunpowder or gold, but the human capacity to see light in darkness and call it beautiful. Sarah stared at the basin of water for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Steam rose from its surface in gentle curls, carrying the scent of lavender that seemed impossibly foreign after 3 years of nothing but dust, sweat, and fear. Her fingers clutched the torn bedsheet tighter, knuckles white with the effort of holding herself together. From across the ranch yard, she could hear Jake Morrison moving around the barn. The soft sound of his boots on packed earth, the gentle murmur of his voice as he spoke to the horses. He'd kept his promise to give her space, but somehow his presence nearby felt protective rather than threatening. When was the last time a man's proximity had made her feel safer instead of smaller? The water was getting cooler. She knew she should move, should take advantage of this unexpected kindness, but her body felt frozen between want and terror. She wanted to be clean. God, how she wanted it. But the act of washing felt monumental, like admitting she deserved care she'd been taught to believe she'd forfeited forever. A horse nickered softly from the corral, and the sound broke something loose in her chest. Sarah took a trembling step toward the basin, then another. Her reflection wavered in the water's surface. Hollow cheeks, tangled hair, eyes that had seen too much. But for the first time in years, she didn't look away from herself. The first touch of warm water on her face was a revelation. It ran down her cheeks in clean rivulets, washing away layers of grime and something deeper, the accumulated weight of being told she was worthless, unredeemable, stained beyond saving. Each handful of water felt like a small act of rebellion against every voice that had tried to convince her she deserved nothing better than dirt. Sarah didn't hear Jake approach until he cleared his throat softly from a respectful distance. She spun around, clutching the sheet, panic flaring in her chest like a lit match. "Sorry, miss," he said quickly, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "Didn't want to startle you, but I brought you some things." He nodded toward a wooden chair where he'd placed what looked like a bundle of clothes. "Figured you might need something proper to wear when you're ready." Sarah's eyes darted between the clothes and Jake's face, searching for the catch, the expectation, the price that would come with his generosity. She'd learned that nothing came free, especially from men who found women alone and vulnerable. "What do you want?" The words came out harsher than she'd intended, but Jake didn't flinch. "Want you to be comfortable," he said simply. "Want you to feel safe. Want you to know that you're welcome here, as long as you need to stay." He paused, studying her face with those steady gray eyes. "I don't want anything from you, miss. Nothing you're not freely willing to give." The concept was so foreign that Sarah almost couldn't process it. "Men always want something." "Some do," Jake agreed. "I'm not some men." He gestured toward the clothes again. "Those belonged to my sister before she got married and moved to town. She's about your size, I reckon. They're clean, and they're yours if you want them. No strings, no expectations." Sarah looked at the bundle, a simple blue dress, what looked like undergarments, even a pair of worn but serviceable boots. Real clothes, not the rags she'd been wearing when she'd escaped. The sight of them made her throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. "Why?" she whispered. Jake was quiet for a moment, as if considering how to answer truthfully without overwhelming her. "Because 3 years ago I came back from the war broken in ways I didn't know how to fix. My family didn't know what to do with me, and most folks in town treated me like I might snap at any moment. But there were a few people who saw past the damage and offered me kindness without asking questions. That kindness saved my life." He met her eyes directly without the pity or disgust she'd grown accustomed to seeing in people's faces. "Figure maybe everyone deserves the chance to find their way back to themselves, one clean day at a time." Sarah felt tears threaten, but she blinked them back. She'd forgotten that crying could be something other than silent and hidden. "You don't know what happened to me. You don't know what I've done." "Don't need to know," Jake said firmly. "What matters is who you choose to be now. And right now you're a woman who deserves a hot meal, clean clothes, and a safe place to rest. Everything else can wait until you're ready to face it." The simplicity of his offer, care without condition, acceptance without explanation, made Sarah's carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. She'd spent 3 years believing she was beyond redemption, that the things done to her had fundamentally changed what she was worth. But Jake was looking at her like she was worth saving, worth protecting, worth the simple human dignity of clean water and borrowed clothes. "I don't know how to be around people anymore," she admitted, the words falling from her lips before she could stop them. "I don't know how to trust or talk normal or even sit at a table without watching every shadow for danger." "That's all right," Jake said gently. "Don't have to know how to do any of that right now. Just have to know how to take it one moment at a time." He stepped back, giving her more space. "I'll be over at the house when you're ready. No rush, no pressure. Move at whatever pace feels right for you." As Jake walked away, Sarah watched his retreating figure with something approaching wonder. He moved with the confident stride of a man comfortable with himself, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that spoke of battles fought and survived. Maybe that's why he understood. Not because he was naturally noble or selfless, but because he'd been broken too and knew what it felt like to be seen as whole again. Sarah turned back to the basin, the water now lukewarm but still inviting. She let the bedsheet fall and reached for the soap, its lavender scent rising to meet her. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't washing herself quickly, furtively, trying to scrub away shame in stolen moments. She was taking her time, being gentle with herself, reclaiming the simple human right to be clean. The water turned gray as it washed away the accumulated grime of her journey, but Sarah felt something lighter emerging with each gentle scrub. Not innocence, that was gone forever, and maybe that was all right. But dignity, self-respect, the radical notion that she deserved care, including her own. When she finally reached for the clothes Jake had left, her hands were steady. The dress fit well enough, the fabric soft from many washings but clean and whole. The boots were a little large, but they were sturdy and would protect her feet from the rough ground. As she dressed, Sarah caught glimpses of herself in the water's reflection. Still thin, still marked by ordeal, but somehow more present, more real. She looked like a woman who had survived something terrible and was choosing to keep living anyway. She looked like someone worthy of kindness, worthy of a second chance, worthy of whatever healing time and safety might bring. From the direction of the house, she could smell something cooking, something that smelled like home and welcome, and the promise that some hungers could be satisfied without cost or consequence. Sarah took a deep breath, smoothed the borrowed dress over her hips, and took her first steps toward whatever came next. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know if she could ever truly heal from what had been done to her. But for the first time in 3 years, she was willing to find out. And that willingness, small as it was, felt like the most courageous thing she'd ever done. The smell of cornbread and stew drew Sarah toward the house like a lifeline she hadn't known she was drowning without. Her stomach clenched with hunger so sharp it was almost painful. When had she last eaten a real meal? 2 days ago? 3? Time had become fluid during her escape, measured only by the distance between herself and the nightmare she'd fled. Jake's house was simple but solid, built by hands that understood the difference between shelter and home. The front porch creaked softly under her borrowed boots, and she hesitated at the door, suddenly uncertain. What were the rules here? Did she knock? Wait to be invited? The social customs of normal life felt as foreign as a language she'd once known but forgotten. "Come on in," Jake's voice called from inside, as if he'd sensed her hovering. Doors open. The interior was warm and masculine without being rough. Handmade furniture that spoke of winter evenings spent crafting, books lined up on shelves built into the walls, a stone fireplace that had clearly seen years of use. Everything was clean but lived in, comfortable in a way that made Sarah's chest tight with longing for something she'd never had. Jake stood at the stove, stirring a pot with the focused attention of a man who'd learned to cook out of necessity rather than passion. He glanced up when she entered, and Sarah caught something in his expression. Relief, maybe, that she'd accepted his invitation. The realization that her presence might actually matter to him was so unexpected it left her momentarily speechless. "Smells good," she managed, then immediately felt foolish for such an ordinary comment. What did people say to each other? How did normal conversation work? "Nothing fancy," Jake replied, ladling stew into 2 bowls. "But it's filling and it's hot." He gestured toward the table, where he'd set out plates and silverware with the careful attention of someone unaccustomed to hosting, but determined to do it right. "Hope you're hungry." Sarah approached the table cautiously, hyper-aware of every sound she made, every movement that might be interpreted as threatening or inappropriate. She'd spent 3 years learning that safety lay in making herself small, invisible, forgettable. The idea of sitting at a table like an equal, like someone whose comfort mattered, felt simultaneously wonderful and terrifying. She pulled out the chair Jake had indicated, then froze as a memory slammed into her without warning. Hands shoving her into a chair, rope cutting into her wrists, voices discussing her like she was livestock at auction. Her breath caught, and the bowl in front of her blurred as panic clawed at her throat. "Sarah!" Jake's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You all right?" She blinked hard, forcing herself back into the present. Jake was watching her with concern, but not alarm, as if he understood that sometimes the past reached out and dragged you backward without warning. His steadiness anchored her, reminded her that this was different, that she was different now, free to leave, free to choose, free to ask for what she needed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Sometimes things just—" "No need to explain," Jake said gently. "And no need to apologize for things that aren't your fault." He moved slowly, telegraphing his intentions as he set the bowl of stew in front of her. Would it help if I sat across from you instead of beside you? Or would you rather eat on the porch? Whatever makes you comfortable. The simple offer that her comfort mattered more than social convention nearly undid her. When had anyone last asked what would make her feel safe? When had her preferences been considered worth accommodating? A cross is good, she said quietly. I need to be able to see the door. Jake nodded as if this was the most reasonable request in the world and took the seat that would give her a clear view of both the front door and the window. Better? Sarah took a shaky breath and picked up her spoon. The first bite of stew was a revelation. Rich beef, tender vegetables, herbs that spoke of care and time, and the luxury of cooking for pleasure rather than mere survival. She had to force herself to eat slowly, to remember that there was enough, that no one would take it away from her if she didn't finish quickly. This is wonderful, she said, and meant it. You're a good cook. Jake's cheeks reddened slightly. Had to learn after my sister moved out. Got tired of beans and hardtack. He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. She'll probably want to meet you when you're ready. Mary's got strong opinions about taking care of folks who need it, and she's been after me for years to bring home some decent company. The casual way he spoke of his sister, of introducing Sarah as if she were someone worth knowing rather than something to be hidden or ashamed of, made her throat tight with gratitude and fear in equal measure. What did you tell her about me? Sarah asked, needing to know how her story was being shaped, what version of herself she'd be expected to live up to. Told her I met a woman who'd been through hard times and needed a safe place to rest, Jake replied without hesitation. Told her you were brave and deserved kindness. That's all she needs to know unless you decide to tell her more yourself. Sarah stared at him across the table. This man who kept offering her things she'd forgotten could exist. Privacy, choice, the radical notion that her past belonged to her alone unless she chose to share it. You barely know me. How do you know I'm brave? Because you're sitting here, Jake said simply. Because you got yourself free from whatever held you, and you're still fighting to survive. Because you let me help you when every instinct probably told you to run. He met her eyes directly. Takes more courage than most folks have to keep choosing life when life has been cruel to you. The words hit her like a physical force. Sarah had never thought of herself as brave. Survivors, maybe. Stubborn, certainly, but never brave. Brave people were heroes in stories, not women who'd endured unspeakable things and emerged broken, but breathing. I don't feel brave, she admitted. I feel scared all the time. Scared of loud noises, sudden movements, men's voices raised in anger. Scared of being found, of being hurt again, of trusting the wrong person. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Scared that I'm too damaged to ever be normal again. Jake was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. After the war, I used to wake up screaming. Couldn't handle crowds, loud noises, anything that reminded me of battle. Thought for sure I'd never be fit for decent company again. He traced a pattern on the wooden table with one finger. Took me a long time to learn that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning to carry your scars without letting them carry you. Sarah felt something loosen in her chest at his words. Here was someone who understood that survival left marks, that strength sometimes looked like weakness, that healing was messier and longer and more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. How long, she asked. How long before it stops hurting so much? Different for everyone, Jake said honestly. Some days are better than others. Some things get easier. Some things you just learn to manage. But Sarah... He leaned forward slightly, his gray eyes serious and kind. You don't have to heal alone. You don't have to prove you're worth caring about before someone's allowed to care about you. The concept was so foreign that Sarah almost couldn't process it. She'd spent years believing that love was something earned through perfection, that care was conditional on being unburdened, that her damage made her unworthy of gentleness. I don't know how to let people help me, she said. I don't know how to trust that kindness doesn't come with a price. Then we'll figure it out together, Jake said. One day at a time, one meal at a time, one moment of choosing trust over fear. He gestured toward her half-empty bowl. starting with letting me feed you decent food until you remember that you deserve nourishment. Sarah looked down at the stew, then back at Jake's patient face. Something shifted inside her. Not healing, not yet, but the possibility of healing. The recognition that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry all her weight alone. "Jake?" she said quietly. "Yes? Thank you. For seeing something in me I can't see yet. For believing I'm worth saving when I'm not sure I believe it myself." Jake's smile was gentle and sure. "Give it time, Sarah. You'll see what I see eventually. And until then, you don't have to take my word for it. Just let me show you, one kindness at a time." Outside, the Colorado sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Inside Jake Morrison's kitchen, a woman who had forgotten her own worth was taking the first tentative steps toward remembering that some things, safety, dignity, the right to heal at her own pace, were not earned but given freely by people brave enough to love without condition. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Sarah still jumped at unexpected sounds, still watched the shadows for threats that might never come, still carried scars that would take years to fade. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was sitting at a table like an equal, sharing a meal with someone who saw her as human rather than broken. And that, she was beginning to understand, might be how healing really began. Not with grand gestures or sudden transformations, but with the accumulation of small kindnesses offered freely and accepted one careful breath at a time. Sarah had been at the ranch for 5 days when Jake mentioned going to town. She was hanging laundry on the line he'd strung between two posts, finding unexpected peace in the simple rhythm of clothespins and wind-dried cotton, when he approached with his hat in his hands and careful consideration in his eyes. "Need to pick up supplies from Henderson's store," he said, not quite meeting her gaze. "Was wondering if you might want to come along. Get some air, maybe pick out a few things for yourself." The clothespin in Sarah's hand froze halfway to the line. The thought of being around people, of curious stares and whispered conversations, made her stomach clench with familiar dread. But underneath the fear was something else. A restless energy that came from 5 days of safety, of meals shared without threat, of slowly remembering what it felt like to be treated like a person rather than property. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said honestly, securing the shirt she'd been hanging with more force than necessary. "Don't have to be ready," Jake replied. "Just have to be willing to try. And if it gets too much, we leave. No questions asked." Sarah looked at him over the laundry line. This man who had somehow learned to balance patience with gentle challenges, who pushed her toward healing without ever making her feel pressured or judged. In 5 days, he'd never once asked her to explain her past, never demanded details about what had happened to her. Instead, he'd simply created space for her to exist, to breathe, to slowly remember that she was more than what had been done to her. "What will you tell people?" she asked. "About me, I mean." "Truth," Jake said simply. "That you're a friend who's staying with me for a while. Anyone who needs more than that can mind their own business." The casual way he claimed her as friend, as someone worth protecting from unwanted curiosity, made Sarah's throat tight with gratitude. She nodded slowly. "All right. But if I need to leave?" "We leave," Jake confirmed. "No arguments, no explanations required." An hour later, Sarah found herself seated beside Jake in his wagon, watching the familiar landscape roll past from an entirely new perspective. Everything looked different when you weren't running from it. The mountains seemed protective rather than imprisoning. The endless sky felt like freedom rather than exposure. She wore one of his sister's dresses, a simple green cotton that fit her well enough, and for the first time in years, she felt almost normal. The town of Cedar Falls was larger than she'd expected, bustling with the kind of purposeful activity that spoke of prosperity and growth. Cowboys drove cattle down the main street, women in practical dresses hurried between shops with children in tow, and the sound of hammers suggested new construction on the outskirts of town. It was the picture of frontier progress, and Sarah found herself both fascinated and overwhelmed by so much life, so much normalcy. Jake pulled the wagon up in front of Henderson's general store, a solid building with large windows that displayed everything from farming tools to bolts of colorful fabric. He came around to help her down, his hands steady and warm as she stepped onto the wooden boardwalk. "Take your time," he murmured as they approached the door. "Nobody here knows your business unless you choose to tell them." The store was dimly lit after the bright sunshine outside, filled with the scents of leather, coffee, and something sweetly spiced that made Sarah's mouth water. Mr. Henderson, a portly man with kind eyes and graying hair, looked up from his ledger as they entered. "Jake Morrison," he said with genuine warmth. "Haven't seen you in a few weeks. How's the ranch holding up?" "Well enough," Jake replied. "Tom, I'd like you to meet Sarah Mitchell. She's staying at my place for a while." Mr. Henderson studied Sarah with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned to read people quickly, but without judgment. Whatever he saw in her face must have satisfied him, because he smiled and tipped his head respectfully. "Miss Mitchell, welcome to Cedar Falls. Anything I can help you find today?" The simple courtesy, being addressed as Miss rather than something cruder, being offered help rather than suspicion, made Sarah feel like she might cry. "Thank you," she managed. "I'm just looking." "Well, you look all you want," Henderson said kindly. "Jake, your usual supplies?" As Jake conducted his business, Sarah wandered the store with growing wonder. When had she last been in a place where she could touch things without permission, where her presence was welcome rather than tolerated? She fingered bolts of fabric, admired hand-forged tools, and found herself drawn to a display of books near the window. "You like to read?" asked a voice behind her. Sarah turned to find a woman about her own age, dressed in a practical blue dress with an apron that suggested she worked in the store. Her smile was open and friendly, but Sarah still took an instinctive step backward. "I used to," Sarah said carefully. "I'm Emma Henderson. Tom's my pa," the woman said, apparently unbothered by Sarah's wariness. "We don't get many folks interested in books out here. Most people want farming manuals or maybe a Bible, but you were looking at the novels." Sarah glanced back at the books, her fingers itching to touch the leather bindings. "I haven't read a story in a long time." "Well, you're welcome to borrow whatever catches your eye," Emma said generously. "Pa keeps saying he orders too many books anyway, and they just gather dust. Might as well let someone enjoy them." The offer was so casually generous that Sarah felt overwhelmed. I don't have money to pay." "No payment required," Emma said firmly. "Books are meant to be read, and anyone friend of Jake Morrison's is welcome to whatever we have." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Besides, it'll give me someone to talk to about them." Gets lonely being the only person in town who cares whether Elizabeth Bennet makes the right choice about Mr. Darcy. Despite her nervousness, Sarah found herself smiling at the literary reference. "She does, though. Make the right choice, I mean." Emma's face lit up. "You've read Pride and Prejudice? Oh, we're going to be great friends. Have you read Jane Eyre? Because I have thoughts about Rochester that I'm just dying to share with someone who'll understand." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah found herself drawn into the first normal conversation she'd had in 3 years. Emma was intelligent, well-read, and refreshingly direct in her opinions about literature and life. She didn't ask personal questions or push for information Sarah wasn't ready to give. Instead, she simply accepted Sarah's presence and engaged with her mind, treating her like an equal rather than an object of curiosity or pity. When Jake finished his business and approached them, Sarah was clutching a copy of Jane Eyre and laughing at something Emma had said about the dramatic tendencies of Gothic heroes. "I see you two have found something in common," he observed with satisfaction. "Books," Emma said cheerfully. "Sarah's got excellent taste in literature. She's borrowing Jane Eyre, and I've promised to save her a copy of the new George Eliot novel when it comes in." The casual way Emma spoke of future meetings, of ongoing friendship, made something warm bloom in Sarah's chest. When had anyone last made plans that included her? When had anyone assumed she'd still be around in a few weeks, that her presence was something to look forward to rather than endure? As they prepared to leave, Mr. Henderson pressed a small bag of peppermint sticks into Sarah's hands. "For the road," he said with a wink. "Emma's got a terrible sweet tooth, and I always order too much candy, hoping she'll help me eat it." The simple kindness of strangers, people who knew nothing about her past but chose to welcome her anyway, left Sarah speechless with gratitude. She managed to thank the Hendersons before following Jake back to the wagon, the book clutched against her chest like a treasure. "That went well," Jake observed as they drove out of town. "Emma seems to have taken quite a shine to you." "She was kind," Sarah said quietly. "They both were." I'd forgotten. I'd forgotten that most people are good if you give them the chance to be." Jake glanced at her sideways, noting the wonder in her voice. "World's full of decent folks, Sarah. Just took you a while to meet some again." As they rode back toward the ranch, Sarah found herself thinking about Emma's easy friendship, about Mr. Henderson's casual generosity, about the way Jake had introduced her simply as someone worth knowing. For 3 years, she'd believed she was marked, stained, recognizably damaged in ways that would forever separate her from normal life. But today, strangers had looked at her and seen not a victim or an object of pity, but simply a woman who liked books and deserved courtesy. "Jake," she said as the ranch came into view. When Emma asked about coming by to discuss books, "Would that be all right? Would you mind having visitors?" Jake's smile was answer enough. "Sarah, this is your home as long as you want it to be. You don't need permission to have friends over." "Your home." The words settled into her heart like seeds in fertile soil. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah began to believe that she might have a future worth planning for, a life worth living, connections worth nurturing. It wasn't healing, not yet. She still jumped at unexpected sounds, still watched strangers with wariness, still carried scars that might never completely fade. But today she'd remembered what it felt like to be treated as fully human, and that memory was strong enough to kindle hope for whatever tomorrow might bring. As Jake helped her down from the wagon and she walked toward the house that was becoming home, Sarah realized she was no longer just surviving. She was beginning, slowly and carefully, to live. 2 weeks had passed since Sarah's first trip to town, and she'd begun to settle into something that almost resembled a normal life. Emma Henderson visited twice a week to discuss books and share town gossip. Jake had taught her to help with the lighter ranch chores, and she'd even managed to sleep through the night without waking in a cold sweat. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah was beginning to believe she might actually heal. That fragile peace shattered on a Tuesday morning when 3 riders appeared on the horizon. Sarah was in the garden, pulling weeds between the rows of late summer vegetables, when she heard the hoofbeats. The sound froze her blood instantly. Too many horses moving too fast, with the purposeful rhythm of men on a mission. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up, dropping flat among the tomato plants as every instinct screamed at her to hide. From her position behind the green leaves, she could see Jake emerge from the barn, his posture shifting from relaxed to alert as he recognized the approaching riders. His hand didn't move toward his gun, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he positioned himself between the garden and the strangers. The riders pulled up in a cloud of dust, and Sarah's worst fears crystallized into reality. She knew that voice before she saw the face. Caleb Morrison, the man who'd bought her 3 years ago, who'd treated her like livestock and called it ownership. He sat his horse with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted, his pale eyes scanning the ranch like he was inventorying property. "Morrison," he said, and Sarah's blood turned to ice at the familiar sound of her name being spoken like a curse. "Heard you might have something that belongs to me." "Don't know what you're talking about," Jake replied evenly, though Sarah could hear the steel beneath his calm tone. "This is a working ranch, not a lost and found." Caleb smiled, the expression cold and predatory. "See? That's funny, because I got word that a woman matching a very particular description was seen in town with you. Woman who ran off from my place couple weeks back, taking some valuable property with her." Sarah pressed herself deeper into the dirt, her heart hammering so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. She'd known this moment would come eventually, had nightmares about it every night for the first week at Jake's ranch. But she'd allowed herself to hope, to believe that maybe she'd gotten far enough away, that maybe Caleb had decided she wasn't worth pursuing. "Can't say I know anything about that," Jake said, his voice carrying a warning that made Caleb's companions shift nervously in their saddles. But I can say that any woman under my protection stays under my protection until she decides otherwise. Your protection? Caleb laughed, the sound harsh and grating. Friend, you don't know what you're dealing with. That woman is a thief and a whore, and she belongs to me by right of purchase. You harboring her makes you an accessory to theft. The words hit Sarah like physical blows, dragging her back to that place of shame and helplessness she'd fought so hard to escape. She could feel herself fragmenting, the confident woman who discussed Jane Austen with Emma dissolving back into the terrified creature who'd learned to make herself small and forgettable. But then she heard Jake's voice, steady and furious in a way she'd never heard before. Mister, I don't know where you come from, but in Colorado territory, human beings can't be owned, and any man who thinks they can is welcome to test that theory against my Winchester. The threat was delivered with such quiet conviction that even Caleb's smile faltered. Now I suggest you ride on before this conversation gets unpleasant. I got papers, Caleb snarled, reaching into his saddlebag. Legal documents that say she owes me for room and board, for clothes, for protection. She signed them herself. Sarah's stomach twisted as she remembered those papers, documents Caleb had forced her to sign when she was half dead from fever and desperate for any shelter, any hope of survival. She'd been too weak to understand what she was agreeing to, too grateful to be alive to question the terms. Papers signed under duress aren't worth the ink they're written in, Jake replied coldly. And even if they were, debt doesn't make a person property. You want to collect on a debt? You take it up with the territorial courts? Don't need courts for what's mine, Caleb said, his hand moving toward his gun. Just need you to step aside and let me collect what I came for. That's when Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She stood up from behind the tomato plants, dirt clinging to her dress, her chin raised despite the terror coursing through her veins. She'd spent 3 years being afraid, 3 years letting other people decide her fate. Not anymore. I'm right here, she said, her voice carrying across the yard with more strength than she'd known she possessed. You want to talk to me? Talk to me directly. All 3 men turned to stare at her, and Sarah saw Jake's face go pale with concern and something that might have been pride. She walked toward them slowly, each step feeling like an act of rebellion against every voice that had ever told her she was powerless. Sarah, Caleb said, his voice taking on the sickeningly sweet tone she remembered all too well. There you are, darling. Time to come home now. I've been worried sick about you. This is my home, Sarah replied, amazed at how steady her voice sounded. And you were never worried about anything except losing property you never had the right to claim. Caleb's mask slipped, revealing the ugly anger beneath. You signed papers, girl. Made agreements. That means you owe me, and I intend to collect. I owe you nothing, Sarah said, stepping closer to Jake's protective presence. I was sick, desperate, and you took advantage of that desperation. But I'm not desperate anymore. You think this cowboy's going to protect you forever? Caleb sneered. Men like him get bored, girl. Get tired of damaged goods taking up space. When he throws you out, and he will, where you going to go then? The words were designed to hurt, to undermine the fragile confidence Sarah had been building. 6 months ago, they would have worked. But Sarah had spent 2 weeks being treated like a human being, being valued for her mind and her companionship, rather than used for her body. She knew the difference now between exploitation and care, between possession and protection. If Jake ever asks me to leave, I'll leave, Sarah said clearly, because that will be his choice and mine to make together. But I will never ever belong to you again. Caleb's face twisted with rage, and his hand dropped to his gun. We'll see about that. But Jake was already moving, his own weapon drawn with the fluid speed of a man who'd survived a war. Touch that gun and it'll be the last thing you do, he said quietly. Sarah's made her choice clear. Time for you to respect it and ride on. For a long moment, the tableau held. 3 mounted men facing off against Jake and Sarah, the afternoon sun casting harsh shadows across the dusty yard. Sarah could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, but she didn't step behind Jake, didn't cower or apologize or try to make herself smaller. She stood beside him, facing down her past with all the courage she'd never known she possessed. Finally, Caleb holstered his weapon with obvious reluctance. "This ain't over," he growled. "That woman owes me, and I will collect what's mine." "Only thing that woman owes is to herself," Jake replied, "and she's been paying that debt every day since she got here." As the three riders turned and galloped away, Sarah felt her knees give out. She sank to the ground, shaking with reaction and relief, and the overwhelming realization of what had just happened. She'd faced down her worst nightmare and emerged still free, still whole, still able to choose her own path. Jake holstered his gun and knelt beside her, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "You all right?" Sarah looked up at him. This man who'd drawn a weapon to defend her freedom, who'd stood with her against her past without asking for explanations or promises in return. "I stood up to him," she whispered, wonder and terror warring in her voice. "I actually stood up to him." "You did," Jake confirmed, his voice warm with pride and something deeper, something that made Sarah's heart skip in an entirely different way. "You were magnificent." As they sat together in the settling dust, Sarah realized something had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just a woman recovering from trauma, no longer just someone grateful for shelter and kindness. She was someone worth defending, worth standing beside, worth the kind of fierce protection Jake had just offered. And looking into his gray eyes, seeing the way he looked at her, not with pity or condescension, but with respect and something that might have been love, Sarah began to understand that healing didn't just mean letting go of the past. It meant embracing the possibility of a future worth fighting for. The confrontation with Caleb wasn't over. She could feel it in her bones, the way a storm feels in the air before it breaks. But for the first time in 3 years, Sarah wasn't facing that storm alone. She had Jake beside her, and more importantly, she had herself, stronger, braver, and more whole than she'd ever believed possible. As they walked back toward the house together, Sarah realized that the woman who'd whispered, "I'm not clean," was gone forever. In her place stood someone who knew her own worth, someone ready to fight for her freedom and her future. Someone ready, perhaps, to discover what love might look like when it was freely given and freely received. The adrenaline wore off about an hour after Caleb and his men disappeared over the ridge, leaving Sarah hollow and shaking in ways she hadn't experienced since her first days at the ranch. She sat at Jake's kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, staring at nothing while her mind replayed every moment of the confrontation. "I should have hidden," she said suddenly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "I should have stayed down and let you handle it." Jake looked up from where he'd been cleaning his rifle, a necessary precaution now that Caleb knew where to find them. "Is that what you really think?" Sarah's laugh was brittle, edged with hysteria she was fighting to contain. "I think I just painted a target on both our backs. I think I made everything worse by standing up when I should have stayed invisible." "Sarah." Jake set down the cleaning cloth and moved to the chair beside her, close enough to offer comfort but far enough away to avoid crowding her. "Look at me." When she finally met his eyes, he spoke with quiet conviction. "What you did today was the bravest thing I've ever seen. You faced down your worst nightmare and told it no. You claimed your own power back from someone who'd convinced you that you didn't have any." "But now he'll come back," Sarah whispered. "He won't let this go. He'll bring more men, or involve the law, or—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice her worst fear, that Caleb would find a way to drag her back into that hell she'd barely escaped. "Maybe he will," Jake said honestly. "But Sarah, you can't live your life making yourself small to avoid conflict. You tried that for 3 years, and where did it get you? Trapped, voiceless, convinced you were worthless." Sarah felt tears threaten, but for once they weren't tears of shame or fear. They were tears of recognition, of finally understanding something she'd been too broken to see before. "I felt like myself today," she admitted. "For the first time in years, I felt like the person I used to be before. Before everything happened, strong, capable of making choices that mattered." "That's because you are that person," Jake said gently. "You always were." The trauma just buried her for a while under all that pain and fear. but she was still there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Sarah studied Jake's face, noting the exhaustion around his eyes, the tension still held in his shoulders, despite his calm demeanor. "This isn't what you signed up for when you offered me shelter. You didn't bargain for armed confrontations and dangerous men making threats." Jake was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Can I tell you something about the war?" Sarah nodded, sensing that whatever he was about to share was important. "There was a battle, Shiloh, where I saw a young soldier get shot trying to help a wounded friend. Could have stayed in the trenches, could have waited for the medics, could have made the safe choice, but he saw someone who needed help, and he acted." Jake's voice grew rough with memory. He got hit bad for his trouble, spent months recovering, never walked quite right again. "Did you think he was foolish for trying?" "I thought he was the kind of person the world needed more of," Jake replied. "Someone willing to do what was right even when it was dangerous, even when it cost him something precious." Sarah felt something shift in her understanding. "You're saying I'm like that soldier." "I'm saying you're exactly like that soldier. You saw injustice, someone claiming ownership over your life, your choices, your future, and you stood up to it even though it was terrifying, even though it put you at risk." Jake reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "That's not foolishness, Sarah. That's heroism." The warmth of his hand over hers sent a jolt through Sarah that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with the way he was looking at her. Not with pity or protective concern, but with admiration, respect, and something deeper that made her pulse quicken in ways she'd forgotten were possible. "Jake," she whispered, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, how the afternoon light slanted through the window to illuminate the flecks of gold in his gray eyes. "Yes? When you drew your gun today, when you stood between me and Caleb." She swallowed hard, trying to find words for feelings she wasn't sure she was ready to acknowledge. "I've never had anyone willing to fight for me before. Not because they owned me or wanted something from me, but just because they believed I was worth protecting." Jake's thumb traced gentle circles over her knuckles, and Sarah felt her carefully maintained walls beginning to crumble in ways that had nothing to do with trauma and everything to do with trust, with attraction, with the terrifying possibility that she might be capable of love after all. "Sarah," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to contain, "you need to know that what I feel for you, it's not just protectiveness. It's not just wanting to help someone who's been hurt." Her breath caught. "What is it?" "It's—" Jake seemed to struggle with the words. This man who was always so careful with language, so mindful of her boundaries and fears. "It's love, Sarah. Pure and simple and completely beyond my control. I love your strength, your intelligence, the way you fought to heal yourself. I love the woman you were before you were hurt, and I love the woman you're becoming as you heal. I love all of it, all of you, and I don't need you to be anything other than exactly who you are right now." The words hung between them like a bridge Sarah wasn't sure she was brave enough to cross. 3 years of being told she was damaged, worthless, ruined for any decent man's love, warred with the evidence of Jake's steady care, his respectful boundaries, his willingness to defend her without expecting anything in return. "I don't know if I'm ready," she whispered. "I don't know if I remember how to be loved or how to love someone back without being afraid they'll use it against me." "Then we'll figure it out together," Jake said, echoing the words he'd spoken that first night when she'd been too afraid to trust his kindness. "One day at a time, one choice at a time. No pressure, no expectations, except honesty." Sarah looked into his eyes and saw the same patience that had characterized every interaction they'd had. The willingness to let her heal at her own pace, to offer support without demands, to love her without requiring her to earn it or prove she deserved it. "I think," she said carefully, "I might be falling in love with you too." Slowly, carefully, like learning to trust a half-wild horse. "But I think I am." Jake's smile was radiant, transforming his whole face with joy and relief in something that looked like wonder. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough to build on." Before Sarah could second-guess herself, She leaned forward and kissed him, softly, tentatively, like someone learning a new language. Jake remained perfectly still, letting her control the pace and depth, letting her explore this new territory of physical affection without pressure or demand. When she pulled back, both of them were breathing hard, and Sarah felt something she'd thought was lost forever. Desire that was her own choice, her own feeling, untainted by fear or coercion. "We should probably talk about Caleb," she said, though the last thing she wanted to do was return to practical concerns, when she just discovered that her body could still respond to gentle touch with joy rather than terror. "We should," Jake agreed. "But first, let me say this. Whatever comes next, we face it together. You're not alone anymore, Sarah. You're not powerless, and you're definitely not going back to that life, no matter what threats he makes or what papers he waves around." Sarah nodded, feeling steadier than she had since the confrontation began. "What do we do?" "Practically, I mean. First, we talk to Sheriff Williams, get your side of the story on record, make sure he understands that you're here of your own free will. Then we talk to the territorial judge about those papers Caleb mentioned, see what legal standing they actually have." Jake squeezed her hand reassuringly. "And then we make sure you know how to shoot, because I won't always be here to draw my gun for you." The idea of learning to defend herself, of having that kind of agency and power, thrilled Sarah in ways she hadn't expected. "You'd teach me?" "Sarah, I'd teach you everything I know if it would help you feel safer, stronger, more confident in your ability to protect yourself and choose your own future." As they sat together in the golden afternoon light, Sarah realized that her life had truly begun today. Not when Jake had offered her shelter, not when she'd cleaned herself with lavender soap, but when she'd stood up to her past and claimed her own power back. The future was uncertain, possibly dangerous, definitely challenging, but for the first time in 3 years, Sarah was facing that future as herself. Whole, strong, loved, and ready to fight for the life she was building, one brave choice at a time. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the parlor of Judge Morrison's house in Cedar Falls, wearing a dress Emma Henderson had helped her sew from blue fabric, the color of Colorado sky. Her hands were steady as she signed the legal documents that would officially nullify the contracts Caleb had forced her to sign, documents that had never held legal weight anyway, but whose dissolution felt like the final closing of a door on her past. Judge Morrison, a distinguished man in his 60s with kind eyes and an unshakable belief in justice, set down his pen and smiled at her with grandfatherly warmth. "That's the last of it, Miss Mitchell. Those papers Mr. Carson tried to use against you are now officially void, and there's a restraining order preventing him from coming within 50 miles of you or Mr. Morrison's ranch." Sarah felt a weight she'd carried for 3 years finally lift from her shoulders. "Thank you, Judge Morrison. I can't tell you what this means to me. Young lady, in my 40 years of practicing law, I've learned that freedom isn't something you can sign away, no matter what papers you put your name to under duress. You were never his property, and now the law reflects that truth officially." Jake squeezed her hand gently, his pride in her courage evident in every line of his face. These past 3 months had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, community meetings, and the gradual process of Sarah learning to live without looking over her shoulder. Caleb had made good on his threats, returning twice with increasingly desperate schemes to reclaim what he'd never rightfully owned. But each time, he'd been met not just by Jake's unwavering protection, but by an entire community that had rallied around Sarah's right to choose her own future. Sheriff Williams had been instrumental in building the case against Caleb, documenting his harassment and investigating the suspicious circumstances under which Sarah had been forced to sign those original contracts. Emma Henderson had organized the women of Cedar Falls to provide testimony about Sarah's character and her obvious contentment in her new life. Even the local minister had spoken on her behalf, emphasizing that redemption and new beginnings were fundamental Christian principles. "There's one more matter to discuss," Judge Morrison said, his eyes twinkling with something that looked suspiciously like mischief. "I understand there's to be a wedding?" Sarah felt her cheeks warm as Jake's smile widened. The proposal had come a month ago, on a quiet evening when they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. There had been no grand gestures or elaborate speeches, Just Jake taking her hands and saying, "Sarah Mitchell, you've made me remember what it means to be whole. Will you marry me and let me spend the rest of my life proving that you're the most precious thing in my world?" "Next Saturday," Sarah confirmed, still amazed that she could speak of her future with such confidence and joy. "At the church in Cedar Falls, with the whole community invited. And I have the honor of performing the ceremony," Judge Morrison said with satisfaction. "It's not often I get to marry two people who've fought so hard to find their way to each other." As they left the courthouse, Sarah marveled at how different the world looked when you walked through it as a free woman. The same mountains that had once seemed imprisoning now appeared protective and beautiful. The same sky that had witnessed her shame now stretched endlessly overhead, full of possibilities she was finally brave enough to embrace. "Nervous about Saturday?" Jake asked as they walked toward Henderson's store, where Emma was waiting with the final fittings for Sarah's wedding dress. Sarah considered the question seriously. A year ago, the idea of standing in front of an entire community and publicly declaring her love would have been terrifying. Now it felt like the natural culmination of everything she'd fought to become. "Not nervous," she said finally. "Grateful. Ready. Maybe a little amazed that I get to have this, but not nervous." Inside the store, Emma bustled around Sarah with pins and measuring tape, making final adjustments to the dress they'd designed together. It was simpler than the elaborate gown Sarah had once dreamed of as a girl, but infinitely more meaningful. Every stitch sewn with love and friendship, every detail chosen to reflect the woman Sarah had become, rather than some impossible ideal of perfection. "You look radiant," Emma said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Jake Morrison is going to take one look at you walking down that aisle and forget how to breathe." Sarah laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Emma, can I ask you something?" "Anything." Do you think people will always see me as the woman who was rescued, who needed saving? Or do you think they'll eventually just see me as Jake's wife, as myself?" Emma set down her sewing scissors and looked at Sarah with the directness that had characterized their friendship from the beginning. "Sarah, the people in this town have watched you grow from a frightened, broken woman into someone strong and confident and genuinely happy. They've seen you face down your past, stand up for yourself, and choose your own future. If anyone still sees you as just a victim, that says more about their limitations than it does about you." The words settled into Sarah's heart like seeds in fertile soil. She'd spent so long defining herself by what had been done to her that she'd forgotten she could choose how her story was told. What chapters mattered most, which parts of her past would inform her future, and which she could leave behind. Saturday dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect Colorado weather that made everything seem touched by blessing. Sarah woke in Emma's guest room, where she'd spent the night according to tradition, and found herself smiling before she even opened her eyes. Today she would marry Jake Morrison, not because she needed his protection or financial support, but because she loved him and he loved her, and they'd chosen to build a life together as equals. The church was packed when she arrived, filled with faces that had become dear to her over the months. Ranch families who'd welcomed her without questions, shop owners who'd treated her with dignity and respect, women who'd become genuine friends rather than mere acquaintances. At the altar, Jake waited in his best suit, his face transformed with joy and love and wonder that this day had finally come. As Sarah walked down the aisle on Sheriff Williams' arm, a man who'd fought for her legal rights and earned the honor of standing in for the father she'd never known, she felt the weight of community approval and support surrounding her like a warm embrace. These people had chosen to celebrate her happiness, to witness her commitment, to welcome her fully into the fabric of their shared life. When Judge Morrison asked if there were any objections to the union, the silence was complete and warm, broken only by someone's quiet amen of approval. Jake's vows were simple and true. "Sarah, you've taught me that healing isn't about forgetting the past, but about choosing what to do with your future. You've shown me that love isn't about fixing someone, but about seeing them clearly and choosing to stand beside them anyway. I promise to love you not despite your scars, but including them, because they're part of the strong, brave, incredible woman you've become." Sarah's own vows came from the deepest part of her heart. "Jake, you looked at a broken woman and saw someone worth saving, not through rescue, but through respect. You gave me space to heal, courage to fight for myself, and the knowledge that I'm worthy of love just as I am. I promise to love you with the whole heart you helped me rediscover, and to build a future with you that honors both our pasts and our dreams. When Judge Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, and Jake kissed her in front of God and community, Sarah felt the final piece of her healing click into place. She was no longer the woman who'd whispered, "I'm not clean." She was Sarah Morrison, beloved wife, respected community member, woman who'd faced her worst fears and emerged victorious. The reception was held in the churchyard, with tables groaning under food contributed by every family in the area. As Sarah danced with her new husband under the Colorado stars, she marveled at the journey that had brought her here, from a woman who believed she was stained beyond redemption, to a woman who knew that love really did see no stains, only the beauty of a soul that had survived, learned, and chosen to keep growing. "Happy Mrs. Morrison?" Jake murmured against her ear as they swayed to music played by the local fiddler. "Completely," Sarah replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "Jake? Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself. Thank you for proving that love really can wash away every stain if you let it." As they danced under the endless sky, surrounded by community and wrapped in love that had grown from respect and bloomed into partnership, Sarah knew that her real life had finally, truly begun. She was clean, not because someone had washed her, but because she'd learned that her worth had never been diminished by what others had done to her. Love, it turned out, didn't just see no stains. It revealed the beauty that had always been there, waiting patiently for someone brave enough to look beyond the surface and see the magnificent, unbreakable soul beneath. And so ends the remarkable journey of Sarah Mitchell Morrison, a woman who discovered that healing isn't about erasing your past, but about choosing what to do with your future. Her story reminds us that sometimes the most powerful transformations happen not through dramatic gestures, but through the accumulation of small kindnesses, daily choices, and the revolutionary act of being seen as fully human by someone who refuses to define you by your worst moments. Jake Morrison's response to Sarah's whispered confession, "I'm not clean," became the foundation for one of the most beautiful love stories the American frontier ever witnessed. Instead of seeing damage to be fixed or shame to be overcome, he saw a survivor whose strength had been temporarily buried beneath trauma, someone whose worth had never actually diminished despite everything she'd endured. Their love story teaches us profound truths about the nature of healing and redemption. Sarah's journey from a woman convinced she was stained beyond saving to a confident wife and respected community member shows us that recovery isn't a destination, but a daily choice. The choice to believe you deserve care, respect, and love exactly as you are right now, not as you might become someday. Jake's patient support reminds us that true love isn't about rescuing someone from their circumstances, but about creating space for them to rescue themselves. He never tried to erase Sarah's past or pretend her trauma didn't exist. Instead, he honored her journey by letting her heal at her own pace, on her own terms, while providing the steady foundation of respect and acceptance she needed to rebuild her sense of self-worth. Perhaps most importantly, their story illustrates that shame has no power over us when we're surrounded by people who see our true value. The community of Cedar Falls didn't just tolerate Sarah, they embraced her, defended her right to choose her own future, and celebrated her happiness without reservation. They proved that belonging isn't something you earn by being perfect. It's something offered freely to those brave enough to show up authentically. Sarah's transformation from victim to survivor, to beloved wife and community member, didn't happen overnight. It required courage to trust Jake's kindness, strength to face down her abuser, and the radical act of believing she deserved a future defined by her choices rather than her past. Her journey reminds us that healing is possible for anyone willing to take it one day at a time, one act of self-compassion at a time, one moment of choosing hope over fear. The wedding scene in Cedar Falls Little Church represents more than just two people making vows. It symbolizes an entire community's commitment to the revolutionary idea that everyone deserves love, safety, and the chance to begin again. When Sarah walked down that aisle in her blue dress, She wasn't just marrying Jake Morrison. She was claiming her place in a world that had once seemed determined to cast her out. If this story of trauma, healing, and redemptive love moved you, remember that every person you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about, carrying burdens that may not be visible on the surface. Small acts of kindness, respect, and human dignity can be more transformative than we ever imagine. Sometimes the most healing thing you can offer someone is simply seeing them as whole, worthy, and deserving of love exactly as they are. Hit like if Sarah and Jake's journey touched your heart, and subscribe to Wild West Stories for more tales of courage, redemption, and the unshakable human capacity to heal and love again. Share in the comments. Have you ever experienced the healing power of being truly seen and accepted by someone who refused to judge you by your past? Remember, love really does see no stains, only the beautiful, unbreakable soul that has always been there, waiting patiently for someone brave enough to recognize its worth.